Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 75, Cannibal Corpse. You just heard Return to Flesh by Cannibal Corpse on the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And
it had to happen sometime.
We've done it.
There was a lot of laughing this episode. I mean, I think I've always Cannibals. I mean, they're one of those like bands that it's kind of a token thing. Anybody, you'd say death metal, people say Cannibal Corpse.
Yeah,
they're probably the most well known. So I know we're not going to necessarily get into a lot of the nitty gritties of the history and whatnot. There's a great DVD that's Centuries of Torment. I think it came out last year. It's probably the best death metal documentary I've ever seen on. I mean, they go into everything, like talk to everybody, have like old performance footage.
It's the only DVD I've ever seen that
music DVDs for the most part are kind of crap for the most part. Like I really don't, unless there's like the Dismember one that came out a couple years back. where they actually have like a good documentary, old footage. There's a new Dark Tranquility one coming out here pretty soon.
It's supposed to be pretty decent.
That's actually has like, you know, them in like rehearsal footage and stuff like that. But
or Flight 666 from Maiden, which is that's pretty sweet.
Pretty sweet. But usually it's just, you know, the live performance, like, okay, who cares? It's like,
and it's usually poorly recorded and you know, different things. So
there should be something free that come with, you know, the bonus disc to a CD or something. But so definitely check out Centuries of Torment. That's you know, like a 3-hour long documentary.
And how we decided to sort of approach Cannibal Corpse is, you know, we rather than get like overly historical, because they have far too many records, and a lot of the records are kind of forgettable, you know, like Gore Obsessed and Wretched Spawn and things like that. A lot of the Corpse Grinder stuff, they're
fine, but they're just kind of returning.
Yeah, I was gonna say forgettable. They're not bad. They're just not anything that like jumps out and grabs you and says, you know. So we decided to kind of take the approach of, well, let's play some favorites, and so Mark and I each picked 6 favorites. And it doesn't mean that like the 6 that Mark picked are 6 songs that only he likes. Vice
they're
versa.
Pretty much, yeah.
We almost kind of agreed on them, in a certain sense, you know. So we're attributing Return to Flesh, which we heard from the Bleeding to Mark, because that was one he kind of liked as a good opener, because it kind of establishes a lot of some of the basic themes that you'll hear throughout the show, but it also addresses the fact that for me, and I don't know where you stand with this, or even if it really even matters, but The Bleeding is kind of my favorite record.
I think front to back, it's probably their it's like their probably the best thing they did at that time, that era of Cannibal Corpse, for sure. I mean, it's the last one with Barnes on it.
Yeah.
Probably they were kind of on the top of their game as far as, like, you know, they had 3 records previous to that to kind of hone their skills.
Sure.
Yeah. And just as far as like songwriting, I mean, lyrics are always retarded, but I mean that's kind of a given. But
Cannibal Corpse,
as far as like, you know, the catchiness of like vocal arrangements and stuff, is pretty.
You could sing along huge with some of it. When we get into you know, a little bit later with some of Mark and I's picks from the Bleeding, we'll talk about the catchiness element. But Return of the Flesh is cool because, you know, you has the really sludgy, sort of, you know, slow, kind of muddy beginning, you know, and then of course like kind of almost a Slayer, I don't know, tremola kind of lead sort of bubbles up from sort of below it, and then there's some really classy leads going on in the song, like, and even solos and stuff like that, which is pretty uncommon for Cannibal Corpse, that you would hear
at that
clean
era.
Leads in that sort of way. So Return of the Flesh, just, you know, it's a cool song, and we'll get a little bit more, I guess, into the Bleeding as we sort of approach this. But
for me, I've seen Cannibal many times. They were never the band I was going to see. It was always one of the openers or something. But only recently have I actually started, I think, to appreciate them a little bit more, because it was just at least the crowd we hung out with. Cannibal Corpse was kind of like the Airsats douchebag death metal band.
Yeah,
it was guys that just wanted to fight jokes, and, you know, and all that. And you know, Deicide
was the same for us as well. Like, it was hard for me to like dig people that were into Deicide.
I think American death metal in general, outside of like Morbid Angel and Death and a couple bands like that, but the whole New York school was something that I was just like, oh, this stuff's just boring. It's monotonous. It was all just the and then some kind of like, you know, pinch harmonic or something, guttural vocals,
or just ripping off like basically Slayer leads and just like deathifying them a little bit more.
But melody wasn't, I don't think, was really in their frame of reference when they're coming up with these songs. The whole New York, the whole American in general, if you just want to put a blanket over it, it wasn't as surrounded in like melodicism as, say, Swedish death metal.
Yeah,
that was kind of the key to all that. But so I think that's why these records just kind of slipped through the cracks for me. Like, of course, when Hammer Smash Face comes out, like, wow, that's catchy as hell. You know, that song's great. But actually, like, going and listening to these records front to back, it was just, I didn't get into them until maybe 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, and it was, you know, the only one I ever owned. You know, my story with Cannibal Corpse is, you know, Grindcore Kuhn and I bought. I remember going to, and I think I've told this story before, but I remember going to one of the other record stores, not the one that Mark and I worked at, and we we went to the record store and this is back when I was buying cassette tapes, just to sort of date myself, and we would stare. We knew that Cannibal Corpse and Morbid Angel were like the two big American death metal bands, I guess at that time. Death as well, but I had already gotten Death Fate, so we had already entered into that. But we would look at the Tomb of the Mutilated and the Covenant tape, and of course Kuhn bought famously Tomb of the Mutilated. We took it home, because we had to choose which one we were going to buy. We had $10 in our pocket kind of thing, and we put it on, and I remember liking the first song and thinking, oh, that was alright, and of course it turns out to be Hammer Smash Face, and then the rest of it just sounded like a blur of just like, what the hell is this? Because we weren't ready to hear a record like that and be able to discern what was actually going on and some of the things that, like, today when I hear like Tomb and things like that, I mean, I can hear the dynamics of the songwriting a little bit more.
You've got a refined ear after listening to it for so many years. I mean, right before I moved recently, I just opened up my iTunes playlist and started playing Cannibal Corpse, straight through, probably for,
good house cleaning music,
most of the day. But I was like, man, some of those older records are actually, like, the production's not great, but there's a lot going on. And I think it's that whole novice approach that they're doing really interesting stuff, but it's not as, like, beat you over the head brutal that I thought it originally was.
Well, I think people, it sounds really weird, but when we get to like an age where we're at, there begins the sort of Renaissance approach to music kind of gets on. I mean, someone new today has to really be doing something to like catch my interest, because I'm less apt to give them sort of the time of day. But a band like Cannibal Corpse has really been around for 20 years, which is impressive. I mean, it's crazy to think
it's becoming common in death metal for that to happen. I mean, I've been listening to stuff since I was like 14.
Yeah.
So
and so and now you kind of go, well, they had to have done something right to have been around this long. And so you go back and you listen to Eaten Back to Life and Butchered at Birth, and Eaten Back to Life in particular. Like 2 summers ago, I just really like gelled on that record. I was like, this is a cool record. It's very catchy. It's thrashy at times, and so. I can say for sure that I didn't give Cannibal the time of day. I bought the Bleeding on CD because I really liked Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead video, and then I think I heard Stripped, Raped, and Strangled on like some metal radio show or something like that, and was like, oh, this is cool.
Furnace.
Yeah, something crazy like that. And I've always really kind of liked the Bleeding, but I always thought the Bleeding was kind of like a one-off, because then Vile and Gallery of Suicide came out after that, when I was a lot more into death metal, and that didn't hold a candle to anything else that I was listening to at the time. And so I really just dismissed Cannibal Corpse for a long time. And I'd say, I think one of the things that really helped me sort of rediscover is when Chris did the Tomb of the Mutilated Hall of Fame issue, because he kind of like talked up, hey, have you gone back and listened to Cannibal lately? Like, some of the stuff is like more interesting than probably we all originally thought it, because we were, I don't want to use the term snobs, but we definitely looked down upon Cannibal Corpse.
Well, it's a cliquey thing, when you're younger, it's like you associate yourself with a certain genre of music, and then that's kind of like your go-to stuff.
The Cannibal Corpse fans. Well, we're not Cannibal Corpse fans. We're death entombed, melodic. We're more refined and intellectual.
We were talking about this a couple days ago on the phone. He was talking with Ovar Sandstrom.
Yeah.
From Nirvana 2002, like chatting or something with him.
Who also sang on
the Crawl EP for Entombed. But he was like, I can't believe you've seen, used to be in the same town with Repulsion, and there's that whole kind of romanticized view of something that's foreign.
Exactly.
And I think that's what we were thinking, is like, oh, these guys they're American, like what, who gives a shit?
Cannibal Corpse was at every crappy metal festival. They were always they were just always around, and so you didn't really appreciate the fact that Cannibal Corpse was playing. Yeah.
Is what got me too. It's like the fans were a-hole and his brother had a Cannibal Corpse shirt, and
and I think the imagery, I don't want to say scared me away, but definitely it's a shock. And I think on some level, like,
it's blatant.
You look at that and you're like, where's there's
no subtlety to any of that.
I mean, like, I take like Tomb of the Mutilated and compare it with like, say, like Skydancer from Dark Tranquility, and like Skydancer had like some like heart and soul to it, and a little that poetic element to it, and so I could like jump into that a lot more.
And Cannibal on the surface didn't seem to have a sense of humor about it.
Yeah.
And especially
and now
when
we know that
shows,
they do.
You have to. I mean, I mean, look at the song titles we had. So.
Well, just wait.
Actually, the first couple sound like they could have been Repulsion or Death songs.
Exactly.
But,
and then
where we get later on, it's just like, come on.
When we get to
what can I say to freak my mom out?
Exactly. Well, when we get to my picks, I'm going to look like the total creepoid, but that's all right. Yeah. It's a cannibal show. So, again, if there's children listening, it's probably best to put the baby to bed for the Cannibal Corpse show.
If you can understand, any of the lyrics at all.
Or even just the song titles. The song titles are pretty awful. Scary the crap out of you. But, Cannibal's an interesting band, and I think now I appreciate the meat and potatoes sort of style of Cannibal Corpse, and, just like Suffocation and although Suffocation was really actually pretty technical,
a lot of
Cannibal was too.
Just came down to perception. I mean, it was kind of. I mean, it was a shame we missed it back in the day, but now it's really cool to rediscover all this stuff.
Gives you something to buy right now. There's not a whole lot else out there. But the first kind of set of music we're going to get into, we're going to start with a mutual. This was our only. Well, we agreed to sort of share this one mutually because both Mark and I really wanted this one. This is probably my favorite Cannibal song, not because it's the best Cannibal song. I think they wrote a lot better ones, but this is like just so catchy, and the breakdowns are ridiculous, and it's got this cool like instrumental intro that sort of like slowly like kind of creeps into the song, and I feel like this is their like pull the plug, in a way, or their zombie ritual. It's like
it has the energy of that early Repulsion death for sure.
Yeah, and it's Born in a Casket, and it's got one of the probably creepiest yet catchiest sing-along choruses you'll ever hear. So maybe you'll be singing along at home. And then 3 picks from you. We got another one from Eaten Back to Death, which is where Born in the Casket is, which is a skull full of maggots. What made you decide on that wonderful choice? It's
got a great, almost like thrash sing-song chorus where everybody screams maggots.
Yeah. And Eaten Back to Death, we should say it's the debut Cannibal, and it's
Eaten Back to Life.
Eaten Back to, what did I say? Eaten Back to Death. Oh, yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
That'll be one of their greatest hits.
Yeah. And it's much more thrashy than anything else I think they ever did. And then you picked a couple from their second record, Butchered at Birth.
I mean, these are just, they really remind me of Old Death and Repulsion, that kind of like punky energy, and just the stupid zombie subject matter kind of Autopsy-ish kind of vibe. Because that's weird, because Autopsy was the U.S. band that I never necessarily looked down on. They're always kind of like on a mythical level because they were so
Entombed, and everybody in Sweden talked a lot about Autopsy.
Yeah.
And so nobody was saying like, validation. We love Cannibal Corpse. You never heard Carcass or Napalm or anybody like throwing like favor at Cannibal or Incantation or Immolation or any of the
Immolation
shits. A little bit, yeah. But Butchered at Birth is a altogether different record than the debut, because it's really just riff after riff, but they're like so tightly compacted together that the songs don't really breathe very well, and it's a hard listen, I would say,
as a full record.
But you picked a couple that, if I had to pick 2, it would probably be the 2 you picked.
They're probably the only ones that have any kind of breathing room.
Meat Hook Sodomy, which, if you want to take a moment and visualize, that's fun for the whole family, little game on the weekends. And then Rancid Amputation, which is taken on a life of itself because of YouTube.
Yeah, isn't there some British lounge
singer that does like a little thing with the Rancid Amputation, but
and actually, Cannibal Corpse is probably most well known nowadays for their Hammer Smash Face video that they put. It's some like Swedish disco band or something.
It's like a Swedish prog rock band
where they basically use that video, and
it's like got women dressed in Native American bikinis and like guys with bad
I don't think they've even really edited it much. They basically just threw the song over the top, and it's amazingly close to following the actual like what's going on in the song.
When I think of like Paul Mazurkowitz is like drumming, I think of like that goofy guy like
with a headband and a mustache, just playing a 2-piece set.
Man. And we should say in this early era, the guys were really kind of talking about, Chris Barnes, of course, the vocalist. And it's funny because both you and I agree we like the new guy, Corpse Grinder.
Fisher. George Corpse Grinder Fisher.
Yeah, Fisher. Better than Barnes, but yet
he's a technically better vocalist, but Barnes
reigned over better music in a way, or more interesting, I guess, stuff.
Yeah, I mean that was another turnoff back then, was the cup mic vocals, because that's what all the TION bands were doing, except for actually Suffocation had a lot of power behind the vocals, but I never saw them live back in the day. So
And so, Barnes is notorious for having written the sickest of the lyrics and the sickest of the songs.
And the funny thing on the documentary, he's like the sweetest guy in the world.
Oh yeah, he's like a stoner, totally harmless, And Cannibal, the way Cannibal's always approached like some of these inappropriate songs is definitely through the adverse of like, this is art, this is like, it's like mini horror movies, like.
Well, and they've justified it before by like, okay, this is the most over the top music, so we should have the most over the top subject matter. It only makes sense.
And it's almost like shock value too.
Oh yeah,
the same way Cradle and other bands kind of do stuff. So, but we'll talk more about shock value when we come back to Talkset number 2. So we've got our mutually loved Born in a Casket, and then a trio of tunes from Mark's pick: Skull Full of Maggots, Meat Hook Sodomy, and Rancid Amputation. That was Rancid, Amputation, Meat Hook, Sodomy, Skull Full of Maggots, and To Brighten Your Day, Born in a Casket.
That's right.
Starting things off, and of note about Butchered at Birth, I think the big criticism of it that you and I were kind of talking about a little bit, which doesn't seem to bother you as much, but it's just very trebly. The bass is sort of non-existent. It doesn't have that bottom end heaviness, and that's why it just sounds like a bunch of riffs just sort of like barreling over you, and it's just like almost like too tightly compacted.
It sounds like somebody had a 4-track demo, like just the guitarist is doing that, and they do the drums and everything over the top of it. But
yeah, and I can't remember for the life of me. I don't think that they recorded with Scott Burns until Tomb of the Mutilated, which is what we're going to go into next. But
I think they
don't quote me. I need to probably cross-check that.
I thought they recorded some of the stuff in New York, and then they heard that sound that was coming from Obituary.
Well,
and everybody else.
I know they did some of Eaton Back in Florida, but I don't think they did it with him. But it
might have been like the other engineer or something. The documentary is exhaustive on all that stuff. They actually have footage of them recording the records at Morrisound and stuff too.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
It's pretty sweet.
Well, anyways, what I do know for a fact is that they do, they come away, I think, from Butchered at Birth, from what I've read, with sort of an unsatisfactory feeling of like, this didn't sound the way we really imagined it to be. And they sort of take a new approach to songwriting. Of course, they produced the infamous Tomb of the Mutilated, which is infamous for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the cover, which Butchered at Birth had a pretty notorious cover too, with the two zombies cutting out the fetus of the mother, which got them banned in Germany.
I like the Eaton cover pretty good.
Yeah, Eaton's pretty tame. It's like a death cover.
It looks like the Return of the Living Dead poster.
Yeah, for sure. But tame in comparison to like what you see with Tomb, and I'm not going to tell you what the Tomb cover is, but I'm sure most
some
of
cunnilingus by some zombies.
Yeah, there you go. Some zombies need loving too, right?
Apparently.
Yeah, and this
Vincent Locke would tell you so. Yeah.
Vincent Locke, kind of notorious for doing their covers. I don't think he did Eaten Back to Life. That was somebody else. So I'm almost positive.
Could have been,
but don't call me. We're flying by the seat of our pants with Cannibal, because this is meant to be sort of our fun approach to, like, what Cannibal songs we'd want to hear if we were putting together, like, a mixtape or something like that. It's not meant to be the official history of Cannibal Corpse by any means. And I'm sure, if you have other Cannibal songs that we miss, please.
Well, we're glossing over a lot of the later on era as well, but
sure. We'll hit it a little bit. We'll touch on it near the end. But we're going to get into a trio of Tomb songs, which are attached to me. We debate on whether or not play Hammer Smash Face, and that's another reason why this record's so notorious, is obviously the success of Hammer Smash Face and its presence in Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and Jim Carrey raving about Cannibal Corpse. And I interviewed Alex Webster during that whole thing. I think it made it in the magazine. Oh, really? In Requiem?
Yeah, I think so. I remember I was sitting at my parents' dining room table talking to him on the phone about that, and he was just going off, "Oh yeah, Jim Carrey was headbanging. He's totally into death metal and this and that."
Yeah, which is cool. And
it gave him a lot of. I think it gave him a little bit of attention, but I don't know if it was good attention or not.
Yeah, I almost feel like it would have been probably better. It would have been a better push had they have done the Bleeding at this time, because the Bleeding was, to me, a lot more accessible. And catchy in a
But I think just in the context that it was shown, it was supposed to show how ridiculous and over the top. It was like,
and Tomb is ridiculous and over the top in a sense,
Yeah, so I don't think anybody is going to seek it out on its musical merits. It's going to be like, I saw this totally retarded thing. I don't even think this is a real band.
Yeah, we got to find this. I mean, that was what a lot of some of the metal of that era was sort of the reputation. I mean, that's black metal. Oh my God, I heard these guys burned down a church. I want to hear what the hell this sounds like. know, and so some of that.
There's a movie.
Yeah, there you go. But Tomb is their Hall of Fame record. Arguably their best record. I think a lot of fans would say it is. A lot probably would fight and say it isn't. But that's not what we're here to do. But the three songs that I've selected for the listeners to enjoy today are, of course, one which I think explores the utter heterosexuality of Cannibal. I'm going to take a sort of psychological approach to this, and that's Addicted to Vaginal Skin. And then one where poor Chris Barnes or whomever needs to go see a doctor okay, with I Come Blood.
Well, it could be I Come Pus. That'd be even worse.
That could get worse. You could be dealing with postmortal ejaculation.
There's a lot of genital references on all these songs, isn't there?
There's some Freudian stuff going on. I think Chris Barnes probably has some childhood issues he's got to work out, but we won't go there. But the reason I selected these three songs, well, Postmortal is probably musically the most interesting, alongside I think Hammer Smash Face on the whole record. It's kind of got an oddball approach compositionally compared to like some of the other things that are going on. And then Addicted has this notorious sample, of course, that's pretty sickening and disturbing, but it's got some really cool, it's got the Mazurkowitz sort of like breakdown. Yeah,
he actually goes into this on the documentary, like his fake blast beat, what you'd want to call it or whatever. But I mean, you hear it, it's Cannibal.
Yeah,
it's just this driving, monotonous kind of thing that he's kind of known for. I think he's often criticized for not being a very proficient drummer.
Yeah,
but he's managed to make like a whole drumming vocabulary for himself that's instantly recognizable.
He's like the best like meat and potatoes like death metal drummer that's probably out there. He's just sort of straightforward. He doesn't do like a lot of fancy stuff. No one expects it of him, and he's good at that sort of just like driving.
It's caveman drumming.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like what Bill Andrews in the early Death stuff was.
Yeah, not quite as proficient as Paul, but
yeah. But and so you hear that on this tune in particular. There's a part where like he stops and like Barnes is like screaming like kind of over it, screaming. I don't know if that's the right word, gutturally over it, and
cupping the mic over it.
Yeah, and then he comes back in. It's pretty catchy, pretty cool tune. And then the medical issues that Barnes is having on I Come Blood come through with some of the sickest vocals at the end. They're almost so over the top. You and I were just like laughing.
They're laughable.
Just like
we're laughable in a fun way, not like we're
and I mean,
why else would we spend 45 minutes on the show?
I mean, even Cannibal Corpse. I remember Chris telling me that Cannibal loves the fact that there's all these like YouTube videos out there. Like they think it's
good
really
publicity.
Cool.
I mean, there's Cannibal Corpse songs where they'll take like Muppets and put it over the top.
Exactly. I mean, that's part of what this is. If you take any of these song titles seriously, like you're doing yourself a disservice. I mean, I think I did when I was like 14 because I didn't know what to do with this sort of stuff. But I think now, reflecting, I can laugh at all this. And then we have a Mark tune, the first going back to the Bleeding record with Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead, and we'll talk about the Bleeding when we come back. So enjoy Addicted to I think
the Vaginal Skin.
Yeah, I Come Blood and
Postmortal Ejaculation.
Wow, you don't say that very often. And then Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead.
We just heard
Staring
Through the Eyes of the Dead.
Yeah.
That was mine, even though I'm trying to look through our fancy pop card here. Postmortal. Is it postmortal ejaculation? It is.
Yeah.
Interesting. I come blood and addicted to vaginal skin. That's our whole...
That's our family values set.
Yeah. Gynecological...
Bob Dole, if you're out there listening, I'm sure that was
This is for you,
your
Tipper
favorite.
Gore.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoy. Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead. This was the first Cannibal Corpse music video I ever saw on Headbangers Ball.
It's one of their most...
freshman, I think.
Like, it's the approach to it. It's an incredibly simple song, but just the stop-start things they do, it makes it so damn catchy. Oh, God.
And I mean, I think what you're going to hear in this next set that we're going to play, which is a trio of tunes from The Bleeding. I mean, The Bleeding, Grindcore Coon and I have talked a lot about this, and I don't know where you stand on it, but, you know, there's been awesome, you know, Altars of Madness. I mean, you name it, has come out of Morris Sound Studios and Scott Burns production, and they're infinitely better records. They're records that I'll go and listen to 10 times more than probably The Bleeding. But in terms of, like, the utter epitome of the Morris sound, if you will, I think The Bleeding is like the peak of that sort of era of death metal. Like, in terms of, like, it's almost like so polished and perfect in a way, and so catchy and
brutal.
So, like,
they still have the same brutal approach as opposed to like what Morbid Angel was doing. I mean, it's still, you know, aggressive and whatnot, but not. This is like, you know, taking like the epitomized death metal sound from the studio with the the absolute epitome of death metal band, Cannibal Corpse, put them together, and it's like, you know, magic.
I mean, it's so utterly typical that's what makes the record great in a way. I mean, everything's almost like you've heard it somewhere else, but like when it's kind of combined in the elements and the ways that it is, it's the I think Bible of meat and potatoes, like death metal, you know, in a sense.
Yeah, and if don't get bent out of shape hearing meat and potatoes. Like, no. I mean, it's just straightforward.
You know, they're not trying to, you know, the Cannibal Corpse weren't trying to do like cynic stuff, and they weren't trying to do what like Chuck Schuldiner was doing. And
they're all really competent musicians, especially like Webster. I mean, the stuff that he's doing on the bass is like, you know, not a whole lot of death metal band. I mean, he's like the kind of the Steve Harris of death metal.
Which you heard in Addicted, you know,
because he's also like a primary songwriter as well. Yeah.
He writes almost all the songs. I do believe. You know, I think actually in this era, in like the Tomb era, like. You know, some of the other guys,
like I think Jack Owen, those guys wrote a little bit, but I think sorry,
Pat O'Brien,
guys, Pat O'Brien, Pat O'Brien, host of Entertainment Tonight. No, I think Alex Webster,
sex scandal, Pat O'Brien, who
no, this is a different one. This guy's in the NRA, and was in Nevermore, but yeah, I mean, actually, as Cannibal goes on, the level of musicianship actually kind of like keeps
increases.
Going up. Yeah,
but in a way, I feel like other than like the Kill record, which we'll talk about in the last set, they're never able to sort of capture this sort of like straightforward songwriting. I think they start to try and get more technical because I think they start listening to all the criticism, which is Cannibal keeps doing the same record over and over again. They never diversify, and they start to, but I think they lose themselves in a certain sense. They lose what made them sort of magical.
Of the core of the band too. Yeah. I mean, when you get a more proficient player in it, you almost. I mean, sometimes you don't have to like rely on like I really don't know how to do this chord, so I'm going to make something up. It's like, oh, we'll just use this chord, or we'll do it. This kind of came to the era of all the pinch harmonic, the real. It almost was cookie cutter to some extent.
Sure, but and so that's why I think I have a appreciation of the Bleeding now. Plus it was the only Cannibal CD I owned for 15 years until the last couple of years.
Two of them Mutilated. Yeah. I've got MP3s of the rest. But.
Yeah, exactly. But we're gonna hear a tune that both Mark and I love, but this is a Mark tune, and this is probably the most like simple song on the whole record, but also probably the catchiest, I would say. And you can sing the whole song almost with Chris Barnes.
Yeah, and it's been covered like countless times. Yeah. Actually, it was covered by, I forget the name. It was an all-female band that we saw at Metal Fest in like 2001.
Oh, really?
They played right. I think they played right after like or before Children of Bodom or something. Huh. But yeah, it was kind of. I mean, the subject matter is awful, but
yeah, stripped, raped, and strangled. So again, another Bob Dole. Whoops, dropping pens here. Family values kind of thing. And then speaking of family values, one of my songs, she was asking for it, and
you really picked some great songs.
I know, man. I'm like a total creep coming out of this whole thing. So I don't know. Sorry. And then the Bleeding, the self-titled or the title track, which is probably one of the coolest. I mean, the riff at the beginning is just like it grinds. It's got like a grinding sort of feel to it. It's awesome.
A lot of these later on ones off the Bleeding and even on the Kill, there's a lot more like noisiness that's kind of added into the guitars to where it's almost like a Swedish tremolo riff, but almost like open chorded or something, and really you get a lot of like just weird noise going on too, which I think kind of adds to their depth of sound.
Sure. So enjoy a trio from the Bleeding. It's good stuff.
just like all the others. Leave me falling after death, strip naked torture. You're dead, you're dead, you're dead. My strangulation, I come alive in the darkness. Left murdered and nameless, dead or buried and rotten. Half-eaten by insects. They think they know who I am. All they know is I locked it down. Face down, dead on the ground. Find me before another is found. It's part of my life.
We just heard The Bleeding. She was asking for it. Stripped, raped, and strangled.
I'm sorry, I can't keep a straight face with this stuff. One thing that's kind of funny, being that I picked She Was Asking For, is when I first had The Bleeding, the intro to the song, which sounds so atypical, Cannibal Corpse, just sort of fast and like kind of, you know, I mean, it sounded like every other Cannibal Corpse song that I'd ever heard up until that point that wasn't really that interesting to me. And I was really into the groove stuff that you heard on the record, like The Bleeding or even Staring Through the Eyes of Dead, which had like more of a kind of a groovy element.
Yeah.
And so I would hear like the first like 20 seconds, be like, I hate this song, and skip past it. and probably for like until the late 90s when I finally listened to The Bleeding all the way through, just and driving around, I was like, wow. When it stops and it's nothing but groove for the whole song. You know?
Well, it's like the opposite of
like catchy.
Like early grindcore and like early Bull Throw records, where it's like, okay, the first like 30 seconds of the song is like really cool, and then it just goes into a blast.
Yeah. And you hear that sometimes with even some of the older Cannibal stuff. But so I thought that's what it was doing, and to my surprise, I got a magical.
You were
song.
asking for it, yeah.
I loved it, and I couldn't figure out why this was like a popular song off the record, because it was I remember like in Guitar World they had like tab for She Was Asking For. I was like, why that song? There's like 10 better songs on the anyways. So Cannibal, obviously at this point, Chris Barnes leaves, goes to 6 Feet Under, as I'm sure, again, we're not going to exhaust the history. And this is when Corpse Grinder comes in, and, Vile itself is a pretty great record, and if we had more time, I might have picked the opening track of that, Devoured by Vermin.
Awful cover on this one.
Yeah, pretty bad.
This is probably my least favorite cover, purely because it's a dude with his like arms cut off, And his
and
gut
he's having
split open.
He's having some issues with his reproductive organs.
Well, yeah, we've got a pile of maggots with a dick and balls hanging out in there, so it's
yeah,
it's a great T-shirt.
You said it. And this and Gallery Suicide are like pretty competent records, and then they get into a trio of records that like really just don't do much for me: Bloodthirst and Gore Obsessed and Wretched Spawn. And then luckily they get with Eric Rutan in 2006, and they make really their sort of next great masterpiece, I would say, which is
After
Kill.
the Bleeding, I would say.
And this is a good record, and I've just kind of been listening to this a lot in the last month or so, and you heard it when it came out, I think, in 2006.
Yeah.
And, it's good stuff. And so we decided to end with a song from Kill, even though it's not their most recent record. Their most recent record was Evisceration Plague, which is pretty good. It's not great, but Kill's definitely better if you're going to go with a later era.
There's more, there's more energy. Just the vocal performance of Corpse Grinder, I think, is kind of on top of his game on Kill. I think everybody's kind of firing.
Yeah. And I think they found the right guy post Burns to sort of get their sound together, and it's Rutan.
Which coming from like Ripping Corpse and
Hate Eternal.
I mean, he's great at like capturing that brutal death metal stuff, but yet knows
good
how to
songwriting too.
Yeah, good songwriting, and he really knows how to capture the instruments really well.
Yeah. And so we're going to end things tonight with my pick, which is The Discipline of Revenge. And
it's kind of a tame song title, isn't it?
Yeah, we had to choose between this and Five Nails Through the Neck. I wanted to squeeze that one in, but we just don't have the time for
Necrosadistic Warning.
Yeah. Or Barbaric Bludgeonings. That's a good one.
Yeah, these are actually a little bit, not too bad.
I think in the Corpse Grinder era, I don't think he's as overtly disgusting as Barnes was. I think Barnes was sort of the king of that.
Mixing the sex with gore is kind of obvious, and it just seems stupid to me. But
exactly. I'm glad that they haven't sort of continued with to song titles like you heard on Tomb.
Definitely check out a Brain Removal Device and Submerged in Boiling Flesh.
Good stuff. But sorry to your chagrin, we're gonna end with Discipline of Revenge. So let us know what you thought. Obviously, these are our Cannibal favorites, and so I'm sure we missed some of your favorites, but that's okay, because that's how we roll here on Requiem Metal Podcast. And
shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Leave us a comment on the site.
Check us out at Facebook or iTunes. Leave us a comment.
If you give us a comment or a star review, that would be great. And also, if you really like the show, you'd like to help us out a little bit, go to requiempodcast.com, click on the donate button, and that'll help us incur the operating costs.
And also look for some of these cool links to the YouTube videos that we were kind of mentioning. Definitely the Rancid Amputation and the Hammer Smash Face.
If you haven't already seen
70s prog performance. So it's worth watching like 10 or 15 times and just pissing your pants with laughter. So, but for Requiem Metal Podcast and The Discipline of Revenge, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
Patience is my ally. This hunter will be lost. A perfect over nothing. Never let my mind. My rage must be controlled by plans. Required time. My rage must be controlled until the time is right. Seeking deep inside. Enemies oblivious. My roots has been deployed. My rage must be controlled by men. Required time. My rage must be controlled until the time is right. My hate has been consumed by time. Has gone at last. My hate has been consumed, but now the scum will die. Retaliation. This was worth the wait. Endurance. Deception. Abhorrence. Vengeance. Wounding the enemy. Losing hypocrisy. The place at this time they are less than nothing twisted. Strength and humanity, they are beneath of me. Only the getting like that blood begins terribly distorted. Results of our wavering. Contemptible beings on the image I in my eye. We never saw it coming. Here's a bloody and fatal. Voices is on silence. Silence.